Alright, so this is going to sound weird as hell, but I swear I'm not making it up. I know everyone on here says that, but trust me, this is real. I was always the kind of person who wanted answers, you know? I'd spend hours online digging through conspiracy theories, sketchy websites, all that stuff. I guess you could say I had a thing for the dark web too. Yeah, I know it's a bad idea. But when you're looking for things that Google's not going to show you, it's the only place to go. Anyway, one night I was browsing the forums. Most of it was the usual garbage. People selling fake IDs, drugs, even, the messed up stuff. But then there was this link buried in a comment section on a conspiracy board. No upvotes, no responses. It just said, "Looking for the truth? Message me." Underneath was a link that led to a private chat room. That's where I met him. His username was Watcher88. Right off the bat, I thought it was someone trolling, but I messaged him, just out of curiosity. The guy was old school, like real old school. He was using language that sounded like it was straight out of the 50s or something, and he typed so slow that it took minutes for each response. After a while, he told me he was 88 years old, said he'd been around a long time, had seen things, and he had proof of stuff no one else would believe. Yeah, classic conspiracy crap. But something about the way he worded things, it gave me this weird, sick feeling. He asked me if I believed in aliens. I told him I didn't know, but I was open to the idea. He laughed, or typed haha anyway, and said the government knew about them for years, decades even. He said there was a whole system in place to keep people from finding out. And that's when things started getting, well, creepy.
"Do you want to know what they look like?" he asked. I hesitated for a second. I mean, sure, why not? He sent me a file. It was a grainy, black and white photo of something. It looked kind of humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. It had these bulging black eyes that took up half its face, a slit where the mouth should be, and these long, thin fingers. It was almost like it was staring right at me through the screen. But the picture wasn't what disturbed me most. It was the caption he added below it. "Taken in Nevada, 1973. That's when I started feeling really uncomfortable. This wasn't some random internet junk. The way the creature was positioned, it almost looked like it was strapped down, like they were experimenting on it. But the scariest part, there were people in the background, people in lab coats, watching it, and one of them looked familiar. I couldn't shake it, but I thought I'd seen him in some old documentary about Area 51. I told Watcher88 that the picture was intense. He just replied, "That's nothing compared to what I know. Are you ready to see more?" Part of me wanted to back out. I was already in too deep, but my curiosity was eating at me. I felt like I was on the verge of something huge, something people had been hiding for decades. I told him I was ready, so he started sending more files. The next one was a video. It took forever to download, and when I finally opened it, it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. The video was shot in some kind of lab. There were white walls, metal tables, and a bunch of equipment I couldn't even identify. But the thing that caught my attention was this creature strapped to a table, struggling against the restraints. It looked sick, almost like it was in pain. Its skin was this pale, almost translucent color, and you could see veins running through its body. Its eyes kept darting around, like it knew what was coming. And then the people in lab coats came in. They were talking to each other, but the audio was muted. One of them started injecting something into the creature's arm, if you could call it an arm. It started thrashing, its mouth opening and closing like it was screaming, but there was no sound. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was watching something I shouldn't be seeing. And then the worst part happened. One of the scientists held up a scalpel and they started cutting into it. The thing was awake. It was awake and aware. I swear it looked like it was pleading, those huge black eyes filled with terror, like it was begging them to stop. I closed the video halfway through. I couldn't take it. But the image of that creature's face was burned into my brain. I couldn't unsee it. I messaged Watcher88, asking him what the hell I'd just watched. He replied instantly, like he was waiting for me. "This is only the beginning. he wrote. There are thousands of them, hidden away. They're here, but you'll never see them. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I was already feeling like I'd opened a door I couldn't close. He told me there were whole facilities dedicated to studying these creatures, places no one would ever find. And it wasn't just the government, he said. He mentioned big corporations, scientists, even private contractors who specialized in keeping these secrets buried. It was like some twisted alliance. He kept sending me more files, photos, documents, recordings. One of them was a list of names, high-ranking officials, military personnel, even a few scientists from prestigious universities. I recognized some of the names. They were people I'd seen on the news, giving speeches about science and innovation. And here they were, all connected to this horror show. The reality of it all started to sink in. This wasn't just some conspiracy. This was something real, something massive. And I was getting in way over my head. That's when Watcher 88 asked me if I wanted to see the proof. I'd barely had a chance to process everything in part 1 when Watcher 88 messaged again. It was like he knew I was still online, still staring blankly at my screen, trying to shake the images from my mind. He sent one message. Do you still want the truth? I don't know why, but I replied with yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was some twisted sense of adventure. But really, I think part of me was just numb. Immediately, he sent another file. It was a document, scanned and old, like it had been shoved in some government archive and forgotten. Classified, it said at the top in big, bold letters. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a list of locations. They were coordinates, most of them in the middle of nowhere. Deserts, forests, mountain ranges. But there was one that caught my eye, and it was a place I'd heard of before. It was an old military base that had supposedly been shut down years ago in the Midwest. But according to Watcher 88, that was just a cover. The base wasn't abandoned. It was still active, but only for special operations. I could feel my pulse pounding as I scrolled through the document. There were references to biological experimentation and human integration trials. The wording was vague, almost clinical, like whoever wrote it wanted to keep things as sanitized as possible. But the more I read, the more I started to understand. They weren't just studying these creatures, they were trying to merge them with us. It didn't make sense, at least not at first. But Watcher 88 explained, in his slow, deliberate way, that the government wasn't just interested in aliens for the sake of science. They saw potential in them, something they could exploit. Think about it, he typed. A species that can survive in extreme conditions, that can heal faster than humans, that doesn't age the way we do. Imagine what you could do with that. I didn't want to imagine it. But as he kept explaining, I couldn't help it. In my mind, I started seeing these horrific experiments, humans and creatures forced together in ways that went beyond anything I'd ever seen in a horror movie. He told me about how they'd found ways to splice alien DNA into human hosts, trying to create some kind of hybrid. Most of the tests had failed, he said. Subjects unstable, unpredictable. But a few had survived. And those survivors? They were never released back into the world. They were locked away, buried in places no one would ever look. Then he dropped another bombshell. Some of them escaped, he typed, and they're still out there. I felt this wave of nausea hit me. I didn't want to ask, but I couldn't stop myself. I asked him where these escapees went. He said, some went to ground, others got picked up by private buyers. I had no idea what he meant by that, so he explained. He told me there was an entire underground market for alien-human hybrids. Wealthy people, powerful people, they were buying these creatures, using them for, God, I don't even know what. But the way he described it, it was like some sick version of exotic pets or collector's items. He said they were kept in basements, hidden away from the world, like trophies or twisted curiosities. You'd be surprised, he said. Who's in on it? I was just sitting there, frozen, my skin crawling as he kept typing. Every few minutes he'd send another file. Most of them were grainy photos or old reports detailing specific cases. One in particular still haunts me. It was a picture of a kid, maybe 12 or 13 years old. His skin had this unnatural greyish tone to it, and his eyes were wrong. They were too big, too dark, with none of that human softness. But what got to me was the look on his face. It was blank, empty, like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. Underneath the photo was a note, Subject 23C, successful fusion, high potential. I couldn't stop staring at that photo. It felt like he was staring back at me, like he knew I was looking at him, and he was asking me for help. I wanted to stop. I wanted to delete everything and just pretend I'd never seen it. But I couldn't. I was hooked, pulled into this nightmare that I couldn't escape. I asked Watcher 88 where these hybrids were kept, if there was any way they could ever be found. He laughed. Or at least he typed, "Ha-ha." He told me that even if someone tried to look for them, they'd never find them. They were hidden in places that no one would ever think to check. Remote islands, underground bunkers, sometimes even in plain sight, disguised as research facilities or private estates. They've got handlers, he told me. People whose only job is to keep them contained. People who'd kill to keep the secret. Then he asked me something that made my blood run cold. "Do you want to meet one?" I didn't answer right away. I mean, what the hell was I supposed to say? Part of me was screaming to run, to block him, delete everything, forget I'd ever talked to him. But another part of me, that sick, twisted curiosity, was still alive, still desperate for answers. I told him yes. He said it would take a few days to arrange. He told me to check back in exactly 48 hours, and he'd have an address for me. "Be careful," he warned me. "They don't like strangers." The chat went silent after that. I was left alone, staring at the screen, feeling like I'd just signed my own death warrant. The next 2 days were a blur. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. All I could think about was what I'd seen. I'd tried to talk to a few friends, but how the hell was I supposed to explain this to anyone? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that kid, Subject 23C, staring at me with those dead, empty eyes. I'd never felt so alone in my life. When the 48 hours were up, I logged back on. There was a message from Watcher 88, and it was just an address. No explanation, no instructions, just a single line. The place was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you'd go if you wanted to disappear. I stared at the address, my heart pounding so loud I could barely think. I knew that if I went there, I'd never be the same. But I had to know. I had to see it for myself. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed my phone in my pocket, and headed out. As I walked, the weight of what I was doing started to hit me. I knew that whatever happened next, I couldn't unsee it, couldn't just go back to my old life. But by then, it was too late. I was in too deep. And deep down, I think part of me knew this wasn't going to end well. When I reached the warehouse, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. The building was massive, old, with rust-streaked walls and broken windows. It looked like the kind of place people used to work until it got abandoned, forgotten, left to rot. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe a guard or some sort of warning sign. But there was nothing, just silence. The place had an emptiness that felt unnatural, like the air was too thick, pressing down on me with every step. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Watcher 88. "Enter through the side door, head down the hallway. Do not turn left." My hand shook as I read the message. Do not turn left? What the hell was that supposed to mean? I stood there for a few seconds, just staring at the screen, feeling the weight of his words. But curiosity, that damned curiosity, pushed me forward. I slipped through the side door, and the smell hit me right away. It was stale, metallic, like rust, and something else. Something rancid. The hallway was dark. the kind of dark that messes with your eyes, where shadows feel like they're moving. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to leave, but I kept going. The sound of my footsteps echoed, each step making me feel more and more like I was walking straight into something I'd never escape. As I moved forward, my mind kept going back to Watcher 88's message. Do not turn left. I had no idea why, but the warning clawed at me, gnawing at my mind. But then again, after everything I'd seen, it didn't take much to convince me that whatever was left, I didn't want to see it. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway. There was a door with a simple lock, one of those heavy metal ones that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But to my surprise, it was open, just slightly. I pushed it, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. The room was bare, except for a single metal chair in the center and a camera on a tripod pointed at it. There were stains on the floor around the chair, dark and old, but the smell was fresh, metallic, like blood that hadn't yet dried. I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach twist. There was a pile of papers on a desk against the wall, and they were covered in notes, diagrams, photos of faces that seemed vaguely wrong, like someone had tried to make them look human, but couldn't quite get it right. Some of the eyes were too large, others had mouths that stretched a little too wide, and then, on top of the stack, I saw it. A photo of that kid from the document Watcher 88 had sent me. Subject 23C. His face was blank, hollow, like he was staring into some kind of void. I remembered those dead eyes, that empty look, and a cold chill crept over me. Before I could even process it, I heard movement behind me. My body froze, and every muscle went tense. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know who or what was standing there watching me. But I had no choice. Slowly I turned, and there was a man. He was old, hunched over, with deep lines carved into his face. His eyes were dull, like he hadn't slept in years, but there was something else in them too, a kind of darkness that felt wrong, twisted. He didn't say a word, just watched me, sizing me up like he was calculating something. Watcher 88? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, but he didn't smile, didn't offer any kind of greeting. Instead, he motioned to the chair in the center of the room. Sit, he said in this low, gravelly voice, like the word itself was laced with some kind of threat. I hesitated, but he kept staring, his eyes boring into me until I felt like I had no choice. I sat down, feeling the cold metal beneath me, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. He walked over to the desk, flipping through the stack of papers, occasionally glancing at me like he was trying to gauge my reaction. Finally, he held up a single piece of paper. On it was a map, marked with red dots scattered across different parts of the country. He walked over, holding it up to my face. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. I shook my head, too scared to speak. He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, and whispered, "These are containment sites." He didn't explain, but he didn't have to. I knew exactly what he meant. "They're everywhere," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Places you'd never expect. Old factories, abandoned hospitals, even schools. They hide them right under our noses. They say it's for research. But that's a lie. They're breeding them, training them, turning them into something else." He paused, letting his words sink in, and I felt this growing sense of dread, this realization that I was way, way out of my depth. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped by his words, by the horrific weight of everything he was telling me. Then he pointed to another door at the far end of the room. "If you want the truth," he said, "it's in there. But once you see it, there's no going back." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I knew he was serious. I could feel it in my bones. But despite every warning bell going off in my head, I stood up and walked to the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, but I forced myself to turn it. Inside was a small, windowless room lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. And there, sitting on the floor, was a person, or at least, that's what I thought at first. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a person. It was one of them, a hybrid. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins visible underneath. Its limbs were long and thin, too long, bending at strange angles. Its eyes were huge, dark, staring at me with this hollow look, like it had seen horrors beyond anything I could imagine. But the most disturbing part was that it was whispering something, this soft, raspy voice that I couldn't understand. I leaned in, and that's when I heard it clearly. "Help me," it whispered, its voice barely audible, but filled with this raw, desperate pain. I felt this wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, what to think. This thing was alive, it was suffering, and it was begging me for help. But I knew, deep down, that there was nothing I could do. I was just as trapped as it was, caught in this nightmare with no way out. Before I could react, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, and Watcher 88 was standing there, his face cold and expressionless. "You understand now?" he asked. I nodded, too terrified to speak. He gestured to the creature, his voice low and menacing. "This is what they've done. This is the future they're building. And if anyone finds out you'll end up just like it." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was trapped. I'd seen too much, learned things no one was supposed to know. I could feel my heart pounding, my skin crawling with this horrific, gut-wrenching fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, caught in the grip of this nightmare, and all I could think was that there was no way out. Watcher 88 stepped back, his eyes dark and hollow. "You made your choice," he said, and his voice was filled with something cold, something final. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the creature, its empty, pleading eyes staring into mine. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I was never getting out of here. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that thing, that hybrid, its pleading eyes locked onto mine. Time felt like it had twisted, slowed, dragged me down into some kind of nightmare that had no end. Every instinct in me screamed to look away, to get out, to put as much distance as I could between myself and this thing. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, held by the weight of everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. The truth wasn't liberating. It was a prison. Eventually, the creature lowered its head, like it had given up on me, like it knew I was just as powerless as it was. My throat was dry, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. And all I could think was, why did I ever follow that link? Why did I think I was ready for something like this? The door creaked open behind me, and I felt a wave of cold air wash over me. I turned, half expecting to see Watcher 88, but instead it was someone else. He was dressed in a dark suit, clean-cut, with this unnervingly calm expression. His eyes were dead, cold, like he was barely human. He looked me up and down, his face betraying nothing, just this blank, professional mask. He motioned for me to follow him, and without a word, I did. I don't know why. Maybe because deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. He led me back down the hallway, past rooms I hadn't noticed before. Some of the doors were open, just a crack, but it was enough for me to catch glimpses. Shadows moving inside, strange figures hunched over, whispering, muttering in voices that didn't sound fully human. There were faces peeking out, faces that looked wrong, warped, like they were stuck somewhere between human and something else. The man didn't look back, didn't say a word as he led me through a door at the end of the hallway. Inside was an office, cold, clinical, with a single metal desk and a chair. He gestured for me to sit, and as soon as I did, he closed the door, locking it with a soft click. He sat across from me, folding his hands neatly on the desk. his face still expressionless. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've seen?" he asked, his voice low and measured, like he was speaking to a child. I nodded, but I couldn't find my voice. My mouth was dry, my mind spinning, but I knew enough to keep quiet. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, those dead eyes boring into mine. "What you've seen, what you've learned, it's not something people come back from." My stomach dropped, a sickening wave of fear rolling over me. I wanted to speak, to tell him I'd keep quiet, that I'd pretend this never happened. But before I could say anything, he raised a hand, silencing me. "You're not the first," he said. "There have been others, people who stumbled onto things they shouldn't have, people who thought they could handle the truth." His lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "They all thought they could keep it to themselves. But this, it doesn't work like that." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a thick file and sliding it across the desk. It was filled with photographs, documents, reports, stamped with red, classified labels. And as I flipped through it, a horrifying realization hit me. These were files on people who'd seen what I'd seen, who'd been pulled into this twisted world of experiments and secrets. Some of the photos showed their faces, scared, confused, broken. Others were just bodies, lying lifeless in dark rooms, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "You'll disappear," he said, his tone as casual as if he was commenting on the weather. "Just like them. No one will remember you, no one will know what happened to you. It'll be like you never existed." I felt a surge of panic, this desperate urge to fight, to run, to do something. But he was calm, composed, like he'd done this 100 times before, like he knew there was nothing I could do. I opened my mouth to protest, to beg, but he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Or," he said, and his voice dropped to a whisper, "you can help us." The words hung in the air, heavy and dark. Help them? The idea was insane. I didn't want anything to do with this. I wanted to forget, to go back to my normal life, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But he could see the hesitation in my eyes, that small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. He leaned back, his expression cold and calculating. "You're curious," he said. "That's why you're here. People like you, they always want more, and that's exactly what we need." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you agree to work with us, we can make sure no one ever finds out what you've seen. You'll be part of something bigger." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken threat hidden beneath them. I knew that if I said no, if I tried to walk away, I'd end up like the people in that file, forgotten, erased, buried under layers of lies and secrets. But if I said yes... My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I knew this was a trap, that agreeing to work with them would only pull me deeper into this nightmare. But what choice did I have? I could feel myself spiraling, the room closing in around me. Finally, I nodded, barely able to meet his gaze. He smiled, that same cold, humorless smile. "Good. You'll start tonight." Without another word, he stood, motioning for me to follow him again. I felt like I was walking to my own execution, each step heavy, weighted with dread. He led me down a different hallway, past doors that were tightly locked, each one marked with strange symbols and numbers I didn't recognize. Finally, we reached a door at the very end, reinforced with thick steel bars. He pulled out a key, unlocking it, and gestured for me to step inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and then I saw them, rows of cages, each one containing creatures, hybrids. Some were hunched over, others were lying down, their bodies twisted and contorted in ways that seemed unnatural, painful. Their eyes followed me as I walked, a mix of fear and something else, something that felt almost human. "These are the assets," the man said, his tone casual, like he was talking about livestock. Your job is to make sure they're maintained, fed, monitored, kept under control. If anything happens to them, you'll be held responsible." He glanced at me, his eyes cold. "Do you understand?" I nodded, feeling sick, my skin crawling. He handed me a clipboard filled with notes and instructions, each one detailing the care of the hybrids in chilling clinical language. "Follow these exactly," he said. "And remember, they're not human. They may look like it, but they're not. Don't get any ideas about sympathy. They're dangerous, unpredictable." He left, locking the door behind him, leaving me alone with the creatures. I could feel their eyes on me, those hollow, haunted eyes filled with a silent, desperate plea. I wanted to scream, to run, to claw my way out of this nightmare. But there was no escape. As I walked down the row of cages, clipboard in hand, I heard one of them whispering. Its voice was soft, raspy, filled with a kind of pain I couldn't begin to understand. "Help. Me," it whispered, the words barely audible. I froze, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I knew I couldn't help them. I was as trapped as they were, bound by fear and secrets, caught in a nightmare that had no end. But as I looked into its eyes, that hollow, haunted look, I felt something shift inside me, something dark, something that whispered a truth I didn't want to admit. I was one of them now. Days turned into weeks, though I barely noticed anymore. Time had lost all meaning in that place. Each day, I went through the same routine, unlocking cages, feeding them, logging notes on my clipboard about each subject like they were lab rats. The hybrids barely spoke, and when they did, it was just whispers, soft murmurs that echoed through the dimly lit room. They were broken, I think. Their eyes were empty, their bodies thin and weak, but there was something underneath it all, a spark that hadn't died. They were waiting, watching. And deep down, I knew they hated me. I'd become the very thing I'd feared, a cog in this machine, a part of their nightmare. And every day, as I stared into those cages, a darker thought began to fester in my mind. I wondered if this was what Watcher 88 had planned all along. Maybe he wasn't just some random contact on the dark web. Maybe he was a recruiter, a trap set to catch people like me, people who were stupid enough to look for answers. And now, here I was, paying the price. It was around the end of my third week that things started to change. I'd been sitting at my desk, flipping through the endless paperwork they'd given me, when I heard a faint tapping. I looked up, and one of the hybrids, a tall, gaunt figure with deep-set eyes, was staring at me from its cage, its hand curled around the metal bars. Its fingers were long, too long, with nails that had grown into jagged, yellowed points. It didn't speak, just kept tapping its nails against the metal, its eyes fixed on mine. There was something different about its gaze, a kind of focus that I hadn't seen before. I tried to ignore it, focusing back on my notes, but the tapping continued, relentless, each tap driving deeper into my skull. Finally, I snapped, slamming my hand on the desk. "What do you want?" I hissed, my voice shaking. The hybrid tilted its head, a slow, eerie movement, and then it did something that sent a chill down my spine. It smiled. I'd never seen one of them smile before. It wasn't natural, not a human smile. It was too wide, stretching across its face, showing too many teeth. "You're just like us," it whispered, its voice raspy and low. Trapped, waiting. I felt my hands clench into fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to tell it to shut up, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew it was right. Over the next few days, the tapping spread. It wasn't just that one hybrid, it was all of them. Each time I walked past their cages, they would reach out, tapping their nails against the bars, whispering to each other in that strange, guttural language. They were planning something. I could feel it, this thick tension in the air, like they were building up to something. And I was caught in the middle of it, helpless, waiting for whatever they had in mind. One night, after I'd finished my rounds, I heard a voice from the far end of the room. It was soft, barely audible, but I recognized it. It was the same hybrid who'd smiled at me, the one who'd started the tapping. It was whispering my name. I don't know how it knew my name, but it repeated it, over and over, like it was calling me, drawing me in. Against every bit of common sense, I walked toward the cage, my heart pounding, my palms sweaty. As I got closer, the hybrid leaned forward, its eyes locked onto mine, that same eerie smile on its face. "They're lying to you," it whispered, its voice low and filled with something I couldn't place, pity, maybe, or something darker. "You think you're safe because you follow orders, but they'll throw you away just like the others. You're disposable, just like us." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. I knew it was right. I was disposable, just another tool in their twisted machine, a pawn they could get rid of whenever they wanted. But before I could even process it, the hybrid's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure, raw terror. "They're coming," it whispered, backing away into the shadows of its cage. "They're coming for all of us." The lights flickered, and for a split second, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the silence, getting closer. My pulse raced as I glanced around, panic clawing at my mind. The hybrids were silent now, their eyes wide, watching, waiting, and then the door opened. Two men walked in, dressed in those same dark suits, their faces blank, emotionless. One of them held a clipboard, and he scanned it briefly before looking up at me. "There's been a security breach," he said, his voice flat, empty. "Protocol 88 has been activated. You are to be terminated." My stomach dropped, a wave of nausea hitting me. Terminated. I wanted to argue, to protest, but I knew it was pointless. I'd seen the files, read the reports. I knew what happened to people who got in too deep. I was nothing to them, just another loose end to be tied up, another problem to be erased. Before I could react, one of the men grabbed me by the arm, his grip like iron. He started dragging me toward the door, and as I struggled, I caught a glimpse of the hybrids in their cages. They were watching me, their eyes wide, their faces a mixture of fear and something else, something like hope. And then, just as we reached the doorway, I heard a loud crash. One of the cages had been forced open, the metal bars bent and twisted. The hybrid inside, the one who'd spoken to me, was standing there, free, its eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate determination. It lunged at the men, its movements quick and jerky, like it was driven by pure instinct. The man holding me released his grip, turning to fight off the hybrid, and in that split second, I broke free, stumbling back, my heart racing. Chaos erupted. The hybrids, sensing their chance, began thrashing against their cages, their voices rising in a chorus of guttural cries and whispers. One by one, the cages started to give, the bars bending, breaking as they forced their way out. The men in suits tried to contain them, but it was pointless. The hybrids were everywhere, swarming, their bodies twisting and contorting in unnatural ways as they tore through the room. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted, sprinting down the hallway, my mind racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I could hear the sounds of fighting, of metal clanging, of screams, both human and not. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept running, desperate to escape, to get as far away from that nightmare as possible. When I finally burst out of the warehouse, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I stumbled forward, gasping, my legs shaking, but I couldn't stop. I knew they'd come after me. The people behind this, they wouldn't let me go. I had seen too much, learned too much. I was a liability, a threat. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, the warehouse far behind me. I collapsed to the ground, my body exhausted, my mind racing. I was free, for now. But I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't last. They would find me, just like they'd found all the others. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. The hybrids, staring at me, pleading, trapped in that cold, dark room. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear their whispers, calling my name, begging me for help. And I know that as long as I'm alive, I'll never escape this nightmare. I'll never be free.